Ali Madad, and welcome to Careers of the Future, a show where students can learn from Ismailis leading in their fields about how to most effectively prepare for the future of work. My name is Joy Panjani, I am a student, and I'll be the host for today's episode. Today we'll be learning about working in the field of architecture and design with our special guest Moyez Alwani.
Thanks for having me.
To start off with, why don't you tell us a little bit about your role as the global head of design for the Aga Khan Academies?
I'm essentially responsible for the design of all of the Aga Khan Academy campuses, and that ranges from existing campuses, as we have in Hyderabad, India, in Mombasa, Kenya, but then also the sort of what I would call the next generation of campuses. So when you have projects of ours like Dhaka in Bangladesh, and then also Maputo in Mozambique. Those are two areas where we have currently live Aga Khan Academy projects or campus design projects. But then also smaller projects that we deal with, including the new amphitheatre for the Mombasa Academy, and then also multi-purpose sports halls for, again, the existing campus in Hyderabad. So the range of projects goes from small scale to very large scale. The context shifts quite dramatically from Hyderabad to Mombasa to Maputo to Bangladesh. And then we also look at architect selection and site acquisition in new sites or new projects, wherever Hazarman would like a focus.
That's really interesting. Everything you do seems to be filled with opportunities and everything's so exciting. I was wondering, how did you know that this was your field of career? And why did you specifically go for architecture?
I think it would be fair to say that right at the beginning of my architectural education, I became very impressed by the power of architecture and the power of design. And it reminds me of when I was a first year architecture student. And back then, we used to learn how to draw on these big drawing boards, and, you physically drew drawings back then. And I remember my first exercise learning how to draw a plan, so a plan of a building. And I was drawing this line, and I had this kind of moment where the penny dropped. And drawing this line, for me, suddenly translated to, wow, that's going to be a real wall that I've decided where that wall is going to be positioned, and therefore it was a house, how this house would be experienced by somebody. And for me, the power of architecture is when you have all of these lines on a drawing, or if you have all of these sort of design intentions on a drawing or on a design project, the way all of that comes together and the way all of that impacts somebody's experience of the world through your building project or through your design project is something that, for me, is extraordinarily powerful. I mean, you're really manipulating how people transition through space, what they see, how they experience the world in which they live. The other thing for me, which has always been very interesting about architecture in particular, is the poetic nature of it, or the possibility for it to be very poetic. Good architecture can lift the spirits. Good architecture can lift the soul in a way that good art can lift the soul. The difference being that I think in architecture, again, it's for me very immersive. You're in the space, you're lifted, and you kind of say, wow, or you don't in bad architecture. And finally, more interesting for me at this stage of my career is the ability that architecture and good design has to transform. And I really cannot think of any other field where you have this amount of potential to directly impact people's quality of life. I think it's something quite unique to the profession. And I think that, connected with the poetic nature of it and its sort of powerful importance, is something that I find very inspirational continually. And it's always at the edge of innovation, I find. Good architecture kind of keeps you interested in what's happening in the world. It keeps you kind of current. It keeps you connected. It's very... it's far from being a sort of a stagnant profession, in my view.
That's a really inspiring story, and what you said about a good architecture is really benefiting people because it brings out optimism and it leads to the betterment of the society. I know that you work for the AKDN, and I am very keen to know about what it's like to work for the AKDN. How would you describe your experience whilst working there?
as an Ismaili, it is nothing short of a blessing working for the AKDN. It's an extraordinary organization, as you know. Um, Also on the sort of more career focused, tangible side of things, it's really given me exposure to things that otherwise I would not have received. Um, the breadth of projects that I currently am able to look at, the places where these projects are located, has really expanded my worldview exponentially. So when we've got projects in Madagascar or in Mozambique or in Bangladesh or Pakistan, all these places, Dar es Salaam, you really start to uh, go quite deep into the culture of those places. There's no way you can design and build these projects unless you really start to understand these places. And because of that, I think it's really enriched my understanding of the world. And that's something that, not being at the AKDN would not have given me. Uh, the other thing also is that there's a lot of smart people in the AKDN. And constantly being surrounded by people that are smarter than you, I think, is a really great place to be, because you're constantly learning. And there are lots of people that can provide mentorship throughout your career, through your working life, which has really, for me, been very formational. It's I've kind of grown up a lot whilst working at the AKDN, which has been extraordinary. And finally, it's really humbling when you get to really see the kind of work that Hazrat is doing, firsthand. When you get some exposure to the thinking, it's nothing short of humbling. I mean, it really is humbling and extraordinary. The other thing also is that, in terms specifically of architecture, I remember when I was thinking about the transition to the AKDN, or when this opportunity came up, and I remember being a little bit concerned that how do I go from being the guy that does all the drawing work on a project and gets really excited about design work, to being more strategically focused on, managing these projects, setting the strategic vision, all this kind of stuff. And I remember speaking to somebody who'd been at the AKDN for a long time, and also connected to the field. And I was kind of explaining this conundrum. And his advice to me was, you'll learn more working with Hazrat Imam on architecture than you would not working here and working as an architect, and you'll become a better architect. And I think that was absolutely sage advice.
Yeah, I think that's really great that you work around people who are at a top level, and they always keep pushing you. They always keep pushing you to your limits, and then you just grow. You just get better in all aspects of life. I was wondering, what advice would you give to students who are interested in pursuing this field of career?
I think the first thing which will serve somebody more than anything else is developing a good eye for design. What does that mean? Well, what I would say is that good design comes out of problems. I mean, essentially, what I do all day is problem solve. And when you have problems in the world, design is a really wonderful tool to solve those problems. Um, I think I would say to young people who are interested in the field is to start looking at the world and identifying what those problems are. And you don't have to look that far away, right? So I'll give you a few examples that come to mind. Not in architecture, but when you get on an aircraft, when you get on an aeroplane, when I get on an aeroplane, I'm often amazed at how badly designed aeroplanes are. And it's almost comical. You get on this kind of this tin, and when you're outside and you're looking at the outside of the airplane, they still use rivets to put pieces of metal together. These kind of screws almost. Pretty much what they did in the 1930s. So there's no elegance in how these planes come together externally. And then you go into the plane and you're sitting down and you're in the middle of your flight, and then you get woken up by a trolley that gets whacked into the side of your chair by somebody that's serving drinks and food. And you say to yourself, have they really not figured out a smarter way to serve food and drink on a plane that doesn't stop half the plane not being able to go to use the washrooms, and also stops people crashing these trolleys into chairs, right? And then, of course, it kind of gets worse, right? When you're having a cup of tea, you're finally having a cup of tea, and then you open up the small milk container at 33,000 feet. It doesn't matter how experienced you are at flying, when you try and open that thing up, it just goes everywhere, right? Because of the air pressure. So these are just some, and of course, the airplanes use, the combustible engines. So the exhaust from them is extraordinarily bad for the environment. So it's really, for me, I look at an aircraft and I think to myself, God, there's just a catalogue of poor design initiatives here. And of course, there are some great things about them and some of the engineering. On the other hand, if you look at some of the new innovations that are coming out, so you look at Hyperloop, which has been created, it was an idea created by Musk, which I believe has been taken on by Virgin, and they've actually been working with architects. So they worked with Bjarke Ingels and in his office to create essentially a tube that will transport people from one part of the world to the other, and they're prototyping it, connecting Abu Dhabi to Dubai within 10 minutes. So the idea is that you get into this tube. It's a vacuum tube. That means there's a kind of a positive air pressure, and then this tube just flies very, very fast, across the planet, hopefully one day. And it will reduce people's transition time, their travel time. It will really change the way that people think about traveling across the world. That to me is innovative, right? There's nothing combustible in that. You can be from London to New York in under 5 hours. It's kind of more or less the speed of sound. That's a really interesting innovation, which is, for me, connected to the time that we live in. Whereas aircraft are not. These aircraft are from the 30s or from the 60s at best. So I think looking at the problems that you see in the world, and I'm obviously being lighthearted about bad design, but when you start to see the problems, try and think about what the solution would be. How would you fix that problem? How would you fix this annoying issue on the aircraft of the trolleys? How would you go about fixing other issues of our time and our generation? And I think through that problem solving, you very quickly would develop a portfolio of ideas and you grow a voice. And that for me is the interesting thing, that when I was studying architecture, I had to wait until I went to university to develop a portfolio, right? Then I developed an architecture portfolio that then you take around from job to try and get new jobs, etc. I think the world has changed fundamentally, and that's not necessary anymore. But what is necessary is for people that are interested in design, people that are interested in architecture, fashion, to really think about the problems of the world, today's world, and the future world, and solve them. Even philosophically, even intellectually, solve these problems. And when you put all of that together, then that will give you a voice. So then the next question is, what do you do with that voice? I think the first thing is you find other people that have voices like yours. That's really important, to create a network of people of your generation who are able to think in a similar way, because that will create more opportunity than by yourself. And then the second part is putting that voice using the handles that you have. So, for example, the way that you guys use social media is extraordinary. I mean, you do it like you breathe, right? But using social media for a positive, curated output is far more beneficial for your generation than using social media frivolously, right? So I think, how can you use your Instagram? How can you use your hashtag handles, whatever they are, to have your voice put out there in a curated way? What that means is that when you do sit down at your university interview, you're not having a discussion with somebody about, what you might do at that school. They already know a bit about you because you're already part of the knowledge society. And I think that's the key thing. How can your voice be part of the knowledge society in relation to matters of design, etc., etc.? And I think the fact that most of us have now access to the internet in some way, shape, or form, it means that we're able to be part of that knowledge society irrespective of geography, which previously was not the case.
Yes, I think that's a really great advice, and it's an advantage for the youth because if you see the world is full of problems right now, you just need an innovative idea, put it down on a paper, and then network it through social media. Speaking of problems, uh, during these uncertain times, and especially during this pandemic, there have been lots of ups and downs in different industries. What would you say the future of architecture looks like considering these situations?
The output or the impact of something on one side, or people on one side of the globe affecting others, is something which is important. How does that affect design? Well, I think if you were to even look at how design has traditionally been delivered, if you look at a basic example like an apartment building, The apartment building was developed on the basis of you need this many square meters or square feet to live in as a 1 bedroom, 2 bedroom, 3 bedroom apartment. And the reason for that is you keep the square footage low as possible so you can maximize your return on investment. I think people are going to start to think about that very differently now, especially given the fact that we are more and more confined to our homes during long periods of time with these lockdowns and other things. The importance of green space in your home, next to your home, connected to your home, the importance of being able to work from home, the importance of being able to design a home now that allows people separation as well as bringing people together, that sometimes you need to get away from your unit as well as come together and keep cohesive. All of these things are going to, I think, fundamentally change the way that we think about residential design. And then that goes into other aspects or other sectors of design as well. If you look at how are we designing schools, what will schools of the future look like? Schools have been traditionally designed to bring students together. And now we're thinking about, well, how would you also keep them apart? How good is the virtual teaching environment? Well, I think we've answered that. It's not that great. So then, okay, how do we now design schools so that you can have the complementarity between virtual but also physical presence? The classroom traditionally was a place that the teacher owned, and the student came in, was invited into the classroom, and then went to another classroom. That may change. Maybe now what we have is a dynamic where the student owns the classroom, and that's their bubble, that's their group, and teachers, are the ones that transition around school campuses. All of these ways in which we've traditionally designed typologies of buildings is going to fundamentally change. But I do think that quality of life is something that people have no choice but to now prioritize. The other thing also is that I think that's going to lead us to a shift beyond aesthetics. So I think people have been in the design world very focused on what does this thing look like? Whereas I think now the transition to, what does this thing do? What kind of flexibility does this thing give us? What future proofing does this building design have, or this product design have, etc.? I think that's also important. The construction industry is really way behind the rest, I think, of technological innovation. Architecture and construction industry were always hand in hand, and it was very innovative. It's always traditionally been innovative. But if you look at the last sort of, I would say, 50 to 100 years, the construction industry hasn't really advanced en masse to a point where it's innovative, right? We're still building buildings the way we did 50 years ago, 60 years ago. And I think also a lot of these pressure points that we're feeling, whether it's from the things I just mentioned, or whether it's from climate change and the impact that buildings have on the environment, I think are starting to make people fundamentally reevaluate the entire construction industry. People are starting to think much more intelligently about how the life cycle of a building manifests itself. The carbon of a material, how that material is taken to a site, how long that material stays on that site, etc. These are all things that people are wrestling with at the moment. And I think what you're going to see in the future is a connection between advances in technology and how those advances in world technology will infiltrate into architecture and design. So you kind of already see it with, the smart gadgets that we have, that kind of help us to do different things, whether it's, sitting in your living room and turning your kettle on from your smartphone. I think that's going to go to another level in building design. I think the integration of user experience with design is something that is far more important to us than it ever has been in the past. And I think that's gonna play out. And finally, the other thing that I would say is that the traditional norms of design have shifted. So again, if you look at the things that people are doing today, certainly in architecture, these are people who are current today. But the question I would ask is, who are the people that are current tomorrow, right? And especially if you're young in your career and you're kind of setting out, you don't quite know where it's going. I think it's really important to kind of ask yourself, who are going to be the people of the future? Are they going to be people who have already made it? Or are they the people who you're sitting in the classroom with? Are they the people that you hang out with Are they essentially your peer group? And I would argue that they're probably likely to be your peer group. So the importance of your peer network is something that will also manifest in the future of design.
Yes, I think that's really great that with these technological advancements and the digital revolution, it provides each and every field with an opportunity to grow. And the idea of separation and togetherness in one house or anything, that's really great. And it's there are endless possibilities for innovations and improvements in this industry. What opportunities should the youth look for who are interested in pursuing this field of career?
When you think of these problems that I mentioned, if you're thinking about a housing crisis, if you're thinking about poverty, if you're thinking about scarcity of land, if you're thinking about carbon emissions, whatever you're thinking about as these problems that I mentioned, um, you don't need financial commitment to dream up the solutions in design form, right? And I think that's incredibly powerful because you're able, as an architect, you're able as a designer to philosophically resolve these problems without any commitment of any financial organization or any bank or any of this kind of stuff. And there's a purity in that, right? So I think that in looking at the problems of the world and looking at the interconnectedness that we were kind of talking about, I think that I think the opportunity will arise when designers of the future are able to identify the problems ahead of the game. That's going to be really critical. Identify the problems ahead of the game. Some of them are very predictable, some of them are less predictable, and are going to be in a position where their philosophical ideas are able to be implemented at the right time, right? There's no use to having a sketchbook that resolves the world's issues, but nobody ever finds and sees, right? Which is why I mentioned the voice. If you're able to solve these problems, if you're able to kind of predict where these future problems are going to be and solve them, then having that voice and putting your ideas out there in whatever way that is, I think enables you to then have a seat at the table when these things are discussed. I think that's going to be the thing that gives people edge is having that ability.
I think that's really interesting that you don't need any kind of investment. You just need an idea, a pen, a paper, and then look beyond for solutions. So before we end, do you have any final advice, any bits and pieces you'd like to emphasize more on?
Yeah, I do. I think the first thing that I would say is do what you love. We only get one shot at life. And for me, my passion was or is design and architecture. And I think when you start to find the things that excite you, the things that you are interested in, your intuition kind of tells you that, hey, there's something interesting here for me. Go for it, and turn that like into a love if it enables you to do that. I don't think it's smart for people to work on things that they don't enjoy. I just think life's too short, and that's also that would be number one. The second thing I would say is enhance your peer group with as much diversity as possible, right? So where you have where you have a peer group which is pretty monolithic, i.e., everyone's more or less the same, they come from the same background, they live in the same place. I think that could limit you in the future. So I think that it's far more interesting to have or establish a peer group that is made up of more diversity, um, because it will inform you, it will widen your worldview, which again is something that I have found to be very important for my career, and also for my life, to be more exact. And then the third thing that I would say is your career is not everything. Don't make the mistake of course, it's important. We spend most of our lived hours working on our careers, but at the same time, your career is not the only thing that defines you. And actually, the things that will ultimately define you are the values that you live by, and that should manifest in your career, in my view. But it's kind of beyond your career. It's more important than your career. So I think when you're thinking about your career decisions, when you're thinking about these kinds of how you see yourself in the future of the world, um, try and think about that in terms of the kind of person that you want to be, the kind of values that you want to have, rather than the specific career idea that you have. And then the final thing is don't get too hung up in my view, don't get too hung up on making everything click into place so early on. Use the early days of your career to kind of really experiment, really have fun with it, really enjoy it, get as much from it as possible, and give as much to it as you can. And it will kind of make sense the older you get. It may not make sense in your 20s, it probably won't. But by the time you get to your 40s, then you look back and it will make much more sense.
Yes, I think that's a really valuable advice, Moez. And you just need to find a group of diverse friends, and then once you start exploring and you find what you love, you should give it a shot. So before we end, thank you so much, Moez, for your time and sharing your experience to students around the globe. Stay tuned to the Ismaili for more episodes. Thank you, Yali Madad.